The story of tea, as far as the British is concerned, is that it's a story of navigators. In the early 1500s, the Papal Treaty of Tordesillas divided the newly discovered lands of the world between Spain and Portugal. It was the Portuguese who first brought tea to Europe in 1600, and then in 1610 tea came from both Japan and China to be carried by the Dutch to Holland. The British bought their tea originally from the Dutch, from Holland. And it was only later that the British began their direct imports of tea from China mainland. In the middle of the 17th century, London was clustered around the north side of the river by the Tower of London. And teas were sold in the chemist shops, the apothecary shops. And then from 1652, tea was sold in the coffee houses. But in 1665, half of the population of London died. You know, if you were my brother, you are now dead. And the consequences of the plague was that people became more health conscious, and they used to actually walk more into the nearby countryside. When the sun came out, they walked, and they walked north of the river, and they went to the leisure gardens. And in the leisure gardens, where they played games and were happy and so on, they listened to music and played the games, but they also had and enjoyed the new drink from China. The leisure garden development had been evolving over 100 years. Private leisure gardens became popular when Charles I began playing bowls at the old spring gardens at Charing Cross. People knew about the fashionable Vauxhall Gardens and the Ranelagh Gardens at Chelsea, next to Chelsea Hospital. People knew of Sadler Wells and Bagnigge Wells, but people are not aware that there were actually 85 leisure gardens which became known as tea gardens in London. Of course, the tea gardens in London were very fashionable, but there had to be another reason why the British became a nation of tea drinkers. It just could not be the tea gardens in London. And it was, of course, because Britain became an industrial nation. In 1700, there was no Manchester, no Leeds, no Birmingham, no Sheffield. They were villages and people worked at home. But when industry arrived, factories were built and people started to work away from home for the first time. People worked 12 hours a day, and because of fatigue and the cold weather, they needed a hot, sustaining drink. So tea came at the right place and at the right time and at the right cost, and with milk and sugar, it improved efficiency. And so the Chinese were happy to export tea to the UK, the British were happy to buy tea, but there was a problem. And the problem was that there were not enough teapots. And it was the Dutch who came over to London, and just at Bow and at Limehouse and along the river there, by where Tower Bridge is today, they started to make teapots. And the Eller brothers then moved up to Staffordshire, and they were in the land of Mr Wealdon, Mr Wedgwood, Mr Corfley and Colport, Masons and Spode. And they have been making teapots for the past 250 years. So London became more prosperous, and they started to build the London squares, Eaton Square, Belgrave Square, Berkeley Square. And it was, of course, very, very fashionable. Every house, but every single house in those squares had the tea-making equipage to be making tea. They had tea caddies, they had tea kettles, tea urns, tea pots, tea strainers, slop bowls, sugar tongs, spoons, tea strainers, tea plates, tea cloths, and tea trays. And so tea became fashionable, as can be shown in this picture of the Strode family by Hogarth enjoying their tea. I think that tea became popular in the United Kingdom because there was always something happening in the trade to do with tea. We had the East Indian ships, we had the leisure gardens, we had the ceramics, we had the industry, we had the age of taste and fashion. Smuggling was something which went on for 150 years, and it was always active until 1784. At least half of the tea coming into the United Kingdom was smuggled. Tea was landed on the coast, and ships also went up the west coast of England to Ireland and Scotland. It is no accident that the Irish had the greatest consumption per capita for tea in the United Kingdom. It is no accident that the Scots got into tea. They were buying tea at a more competitive price. Of course, the East India Company had had tea auctions from 1769, and in Leadenhall Street, the magnificence of the East India House was known throughout London as the place where 4 times a year they had the tea auctions. And they were vibrant, exciting affairs. And even in the Leadenhall market nearby, you could hear the shouts and cries of the bidding in the sales. The United Kingdom had very important colonies in the West Indies to supply the sugar. Our colonies in America were equally important for commercial general trading terms, but the British were not too happy about the Americans buying their tea from Holland. The East India Company, admittedly they had excessive stocks at the time, they wanted to dispose of their teas without the Americans having to pay the UK import duty. And so the government agreed to that, but the government did insist that the Americans were charged 3p colonial tax to help pay for the American army. The Americans were not happy about this tax, and they said without representation in London there would be no taxation. And when the ships arrived in Boston, they were not allowed to discharge their tea. So the Americans threw the tea into the harbour at Boston, and it became known as the Boston Tea Party, a very important development because it led to the War of Independence and the creation of the United States of America. It also, incidentally, explains why the Americans turned to coffee and the British retained their allegiance for tea. In the 1700s, an increasing amount of tea was being imported into the United Kingdom, and the East India Company had the problem of paying for it. They wished to sell British manufactured goods to the Chinese, but the Chinese said, no, we have our own civilization, and we have our own textiles, we have our own silks, we have our own ceramics, we have our own gunpowder. There is nothing that we wish to buy from the United Kingdom. But on the other hand, there was just one thing that they did want, and that was opium. And it so happened that the East India Company controlled the production and growing of opium in India. And so opium was smuggled out of Bombay and Calcutta into the Chinese ports, and it was smuggled in the fastest and the most beautiful and the best made sailing ships that have ever been made. They were fast to outrun pirates in the China seas. And the opium clippers, of course, became the tea clippers. And finally, the Chinese authorities in Peking became upset about this opium business, trade, and they sent soldiers to Canton, and they burnt 20,000 boxes of opium, and it led to the Opium Wars with the British, and the relationships between Anglo-China relationships became very strained, and it prompted the East India Company to actively look for the possibility of growing tea in other parts of the world. It was in 1788 that Joseph Banks recommended to the East India Company that it would be quite possible that tea could be grown in that area of northeast India by the Brahmaputra Valley. And he not only said it would be possible, but he made practical suggestions as to how tea could be brought from China through the botanical gardens in Calcutta and sent up country. In fact, the English found tea growing wild in Assam. It was growing to the height of trees, and it seemed to be that the difference between the tea from Japan and China and India was that in Japan and China you take the leaf off the bushes 2 or 3 times a year. But with this new tea in India, it was obvious that it could be taken off the bushes every 2 weeks for 6 months. And so we were talking about tea growing in the indigenous home for tea. It was the wind that had blown tea into China over 3,000 or 4,000 years. The original home for tea was northeast India. Lots of young Englishmen, Scotsmen, Welshmen, Irishmen went to northeast India as they went to other parts of the world. They sailed down the west coast of Africa, round the Cape, across to India, and then round to Calcutta, and they walked up to the tea-growing areas. And many were only 17 or 18 when they left the UK, and by the time they were 25, 1/3 of them were dead. They died of yellow fever, they died of malaria, and some, no doubt, died of alcohol, maybe even loneliness. By 1900, there were 4,000 tea gardens in North and South India and 2,000 tea gardens in Ceylon. Gradually, these teas overtook the imports from China. For 200 years, the Chinese had been blending or mixing their teas to create a uniformity. Whether it be 6 chests or 60 chests, the quality would be the same. But on the Indian gardens, the teas tasted different from garden to garden, rather like a French wine. But not only was the tea different from garden to garden, the tea from any one single garden was changing every time it was produced and delivered. So every 2 weeks or so, each consignment of tea was different to the previous delivery. And so the London tea tasters had to become very expert at judging the quality of these gardens, these individual gardens, as the quality changed throughout the year. The new season's tea, the first flush teas, the second flush, teas produced in the rains, the autumnal teas, and the end of season teas. London, in order to create a constant quality at a constant price, became very good at blending teas together. And this created the famous brand names that became known throughout not only the United Kingdom but throughout the world. Industrialisation, of course, brought the railways, and the railways brought ladies into London from the suburbs to enjoy in Regent Street or Piccadilly a break from their shopping while they had tea. And afternoon tea in tea shops became very, very fashionable. From 1650, 1750, 1850, all of the tea coming into the United Kingdom came from China. But from 1850 to 1950, the China imports went virtually to zero, and all the tea had been replaced with tea from India and Ceylon. The tea auctions in London became famous, the tea blending companies in London became famous, and the tea shops in London became famous. But in 1939, of course, the war broke out, and the first thing the British government did was to stop the tea auctions, to ration the tea. Every family had 2 ounces of tea per person per week, and the tea in the warehouses was distributed around the United Kingdom. After the war, tea rationing actually carried on right through from 1945 to 1952. So tea was rationed in the United Kingdom for 12 years. And the latter part of those years, London was very austere. But in 1952, when they started the tea auctions again, everybody expected a renaissance of the tea trade. But it never happened. What did happen is that a coffee bar was opened in London, and it was opened because of the availability of a new machine, which was rather the size of a television set, except it had handles on the top, and it was, of course, in fact, an espresso machine, a machine that made coffee from Italy. More espresso machines were sold, more coffee bars were opened, and that started the phenomena of coffee bars. The press started to write about the coffee bars. That in turn made the producers of coffee in Costa Rica and Colombia and Brazil and Africa look at the London market, and they wondered how they should sell their coffees to the UK market. Should the coffee be as a liquid extract, rather like the old camp coffee, or should it be made in vacuum packs, or should it be made in tablets, or should they inject every baby at birth with coffee to increase the sales? In fact, they need not have bothered, because in 1955 the only television you could see in the United Kingdom was BBC television, but the next year they introduced commercial TV. And a characteristic of commercial television is that between the programmes there is a space for advertising. And the entrepreneurs in coffee and television started to advertise not a soluble coffee, but a spray-dried powdered coffee. And they advertised it night after night after night after night to the great British public for 40 years. The British public were not injected, they were brainwashed to drink soluble coffee. And of course, the sales of coffee have gone up and up and up and up. And today, 50 years later, coffee, the expenditure on coffee is greater than it is for tea, and there are coffee bars throughout the city in London and the West End, and all that was stimulated, that interest in coffee was stimulated by television advertising. The tea trade woke up in the morning in the late 50s, and they frankly did not understand what had hit them. They had the worst scenario. They had 100-year-old companies, they had sales going down, and they had big overheads. They were not experienced at how to deal with television advertising. But on the production side, some people said, well, perhaps instead of rolling the leaf as we've done it for thousands of years, and we do it in a modern way in India, why don't we chop this leaf and put it through a different kind of machine so that the tea could be crushed and torn and curled much faster. So it created a violent oxidization of the leaf, which would produce a tea which would infuse very fast. It would, in fact, be within seconds red in the cup and red in the pot. And this tea was produced. It was called CTC tea, and it was a modern form of tea, and it was put into tea bags. UK tea firms started to advertise tea bags, and so tea bags became so popular in the UK that today 90% of the market are using tea bags. I had the idea for a tea museum in 1952, but it took 40 years to put the collection together, and we finally opened in 1992. I must say that I think that if people are not educated how to buy good quality leaf tea, how to buy good quality coffee beans, then where do they get the knowledge from? So I think it's a privilege for us to have a tea and coffee museum in London, and we do hope very much that visitors from Moscow will come and see us and enjoy with us the finest tea and coffee that we can buy in London.